For those who've seen the show Spongebob Squarepants, there's a bit of detail that you might have missed. In fact, the detail is so dark that it might make you see the show in a bit of a different light. In fact, most people I've actually explained this to have gone back, watched the show, and been like, whoa, how did I miss that? Before I continue, please do subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, and leave in a comment what you think about this video, or rather what you think about what we're about to talk about. So Spongebob Squarepants, most of you have seen the cartoon series, but there is one character that really does stand out in it all. No, I'm not talking about the grumpy Squidward, and I'm not talking about Spongebob Squarepants himself. Yes, I'm talking about the ever-exploitative character of MrKrabs himself. Now, if you remember MrKrabs, you will remember the fact that he's this character who exploits every situation he can possibly find in order to make more money. When he hears an opportunity, dollar signs immediately just take over his eyes. But I don't know if you realize, it's actually the only crab in the entire show. I mean, because of all of my younger siblings, I got to actually watch most of the episodes of the show, and I can't remember seeing any other crab aside from MrKrabs. Well, have that in mind while we talk about the bestseller in his so-called restaurant, which is the Krabby Patty. And let's ask ourselves, what is the main ingredient of the Krabby Patty? Obviously, crabs. Now, when you think of it, and you put two and two together, the lack of crabs, other than himself in the show, and the availability, or should I say the ready availability of Krabby Patties, it does make you wonder, how is that actually possible? I mean, actually think about it. Isn't this guy actually like taking advantage of the genocide that has been done to people of his kind? You know, is he killing his own people in order to make a buck? Now, when you think of this sort of exploitation, what does that remind you of in real life? Or should I say, where does that remind you of in real life? I say pause the video and actually, write in the comments where that reminds you of before we continue. For me, that actually reminds me of much of Africa and the third world countries. Africa being a continent, by the way, not a country. A continent of about 40 different countries and so many diverse ethnic groups. You see, for centuries now, there has been the much talked about and sometimes documented exploitation of Africans in the continent and also in the diaspora. There's also been the much talked about exploitation of Africa's resources in so many African countries. Countries like the two Congos, Liberia, and even Sierra Leone. And these exploitations have always been enabled by Africans themselves. In most cases, African leaders who have either seized power or been voted in by a majority that really don't know what's going on. Well, let's talk about slave trade, for instance. You had the Arab slave trade and then you had the European slave trade. There isn't so much in terms of documentation when it comes to the Arab slave trade, but we do have a lot of documentation when it comes to European slave trade. So let's base our arguments on the European slave trade. Do you know that it's a fact that those who actually went into the bushes, into the villages, into the forests, and fought Africans were actually Africans themselves? Yes, we actually did have, African slave traders. People who would raid farms and villages and pillage them and capture human beings and sell them off to the Europeans for pretty much pennies and cheap items. Some may argue that Africa was broken up into villages and kingdoms and ethnic groups and tribes and what have you, and there was zero unity amongst its people. And one may also argue that African slave traders were unaware of the fact that their idea of slavery did not match that of the Europeans, whose idea of slavery was, well, far, far, far different and far more brutal than the Africans' idea. Now let's move to colonial times, where Africa got divided like chocolate cake as a birthday party, after which colonies were set up and exploitation got upgraded from that of human resources to that of natural resources. And still in those times, some Africans enabled the exploitation. And we come down to present day, where exploitation of resources are being enabled by puppets dressed up as African leaders. And if you don't see the similarities with Mr. Crab, then let me make it plain and simple to you. There are a few thousands of Africans who are exploiting hundreds of millions of Africans, if not billions of Africans, in the continent, and the resources that are meant for billions of Africans in the continent. And with the way it's going, if care isn't taken and this continues, there will be a reduction in the population of Africans on the continent. As skilled and educated Africans leave the continent for greener pastures, and those who are not able to leave have their life expectancy shortened. To avoid this, we all need to wake up and wise up. We all have to unite as a collective, focus on the growth and development of Africans and the African continent itself. It's only when we put aside our personal greed and interests can we finally get to see the dark continent glitter even more than gold. Like I said earlier, Africans need to wake up and rise up. So let me know in the comments what you think. Do you think Africa stands a chance? Do you think Africa will one day become the giants that it's meant to be? Leave in the comments what you think.